Gather around the fire, where the flickering flames cast shadows that dance like ghosts, and the whisper of the forest night hides secrets too terrible to speak. Tonight I have a tale for you, one that will linger long after the embers die down. So sit back, get comfortable, and listen closely. Because once this story begins, there's no turning back. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a group of friends, a remote cabin, and a campfire under the stars. Amy, Brian, Lisa, and Mark had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. They wanted to escape the chaos of the city, just for a few days, to breathe in the crisp, clean air and forget about everything else. The cabin sat deep within Blackwood Forest, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick, dark woods that seemed to stretch on forever. They arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows across the dirt road that wound through the trees. The cabin was quaint, almost picturesque, with its rustic wooden frame and a small porch that overlooked the clearing. As they unloaded their bags, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, like they were being watched. But he quickly brushed it off. It was just the isolation getting to him. They hadn't seen another car for miles, and the silence of the forest was unnerving. The first night was perfect. They laughed, roasted marshmallows, and shared old stories around the fire, the warmth of the flames pushing back the night's chill. The flickering light painted their faces with a warm glow, making the shadows dance around them. It was the kind of night they had all hoped for, simple, carefree, and far removed from the bustle of their daily lives. But as the night wore on and the fire began to die down, the mood shifted. It started with a faint sound, rustling just beyond the ring of light, too far away to see. Brian was the first to notice, pausing mid-sentence. "Did you guys hear that?" The others fell silent, straining to listen. For a moment there was nothing, just the gentle crackle of the fire. But then it came again, soft, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Amy laughed nervously, trying to shake it off. "Probably just an animal," she said, though her eyes darted nervously toward the darkness. "We are in the middle of the woods, after all." They tried to brush it off, but the sounds continued, rustling, shuffling, sometimes a faint snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. The firelight flickered, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing minute. Mark, always the skeptic, stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he said. "It's probably just a deer or something." Mark walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. The others watched, barely breathing, as he disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, crash. Something darted across the edge of the firelight, a blur of movement that made everyone jump. Brian nearly fell off his seat, and Lisa let out a stifled scream. Mark re-emerged, looking slightly shaken but trying to play it cool. "Nothing there," he said, though his voice was a little unsteady. "Must have been a raccoon or something." They tried to laugh it off, but the mood was broken. They huddled a little closer to the fire, as if it could protect them from whatever was out there. But the sounds didn't stop. They were soft at first, just barely noticeable over the crackling of the fire, but gradually they grew louder. Footsteps, circling the camp. Sometimes they sounded close, almost right behind them, and then far away, as if something was darting around the trees, watching, waiting. Amy was the first to suggest they go inside, but Brian, ever the daredevil, shook his head. "Come on, guys. We're not going to let a few creepy noises ruin our night. Besides," he added with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "what's a campfire without a ghost story?" So they stayed, the fire burning lower, and Brian began to tell a story. It was an old local legend, something he'd heard from his grandfather. "They say Blackwood Forest is haunted," he began, his voice low and serious. "Years ago, a group of loggers disappeared without a trace, They went into the forest one morning, and by evening, they were gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. As he spoke, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees, making the flames dance wildly. Some say the forest took them, Brian continued, that it doesn't like visitors, and it has its own way of getting rid of them. People have seen things out here, shadows that move on their own, whispers in the night. Some even say they've heard voices, calling them deeper into the woods. The group sat quietly, entranced by Brian's tale, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The fire flickered, and for a moment it seemed like the shadows around them were growing, stretching further into the light. Amy thought she heard a faint murmur just beyond the reach of her ears. She turned to look at Brian, but he was staring blankly into the flames, his face oddly pale. "What's wrong?" she whispered, but Brian didn't respond. He just kept staring, as if he was seeing something they couldn't. Then, slowly, he turned his head, eyes fixed on a dark spot just beyond the campfire's light. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others followed his gaze, squinting to see what he was looking at. But there was nothing there, just the dark, endless stretch of the forest. "Stop trying to scare us, Brian," Mark said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's not funny." But Brian didn't smile. "I'm not," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw someone, standing right there." He pointed to a spot just a few feet away from the fire, where the shadows were darkest. "They were just watching us." The wind howled louder, making the branches above them sway and creak. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the air, but it didn't feel warm anymore. It felt cold, almost like the flames were struggling to stay alive. Amy shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Maybe we should go inside," she suggested, her voice shaky. "It's getting late." But just as they were about to stand up, they heard it, footsteps slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They were louder this time, unmistakable, and they were getting closer. Lisa grabbed Mark's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Oh my God, do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the darkness, a voice called out. "Hello?" It was soft, almost gentle, but there was something off about it. Something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. "Is someone there?" The group froze, their eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source of the voice. But there was no one there, just the dark, impenetrable forest and the flickering light of their dying fire. "Who's there?" Mark called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Show yourself." But there was no reply. The wind died down, leaving behind a deafening silence, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves. For a moment, they thought it was over, that maybe they had imagined it. But then, they heard it again. Closer this time. "Hello?" The voice was clearer now, and they realized it was coming from all around them, echoing through the trees like a whisper. Amy's heart was pounding in her chest. She could barely breathe, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her flashlight. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice cracking. "Who's out there?" The flashlight flicked on, casting a weak beam of light into the darkness. She swept it around the clearing, her breath hitching as the light caught on something, eyes glinting in the dark just for a moment. And then they were gone, disappearing into the shadows. "I saw something," she gasped, turning to the others. "There's someone out there." The group scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with fear. The fire was almost out, the light fading, and the darkness seemed to press in around them, suffocating. "We need to go inside," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Now." They hurried back to the cabin, their footsteps loud and frantic on the dirt. But as they reached the porch, Amy glanced over her shoulder, and she saw it again. those same glinting eyes, watching them from the edge of the clearing. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears, but when she looked again, they were gone. They bolted the door behind them, locking every window, pulling the curtains shut. But the fear didn't fade. It clung to them, a cold, suffocating weight, as they huddled together in the darkened living room. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you see it too?" Amy nodded, her hands still shaking. "It was watching us," she said, her voice hollow. "It was waiting." The night dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours. They sat in silence, listening to the creaks and groans of the old cabin, every noise amplified in the dark. And then, just as they were starting to think they might make it through the night, they heard it again, the voice clear and close, as if it was right outside the window. "Hello?" Brian's face went pale, his eyes wide with terror. "That's my voice," he whispered, his words barely more than a breath. "That's my voice." Brian's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The others stared at him, confusion giving way to creeping dread. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. But Brian didn't need to explain. The voice came again, louder this time, clear as day. "Hello?" It was unmistakable. Brian's voice, mimicked perfectly, but there was something twisted in the tone. It was a mockery, stretched and distorted, like a recording played backward. Lisa scrambled off the couch, eyes wide. "This can't be happening. It's not possible." As they whispered frantically among themselves, the voice came once more, and this time it wasn't outside. It was inside, echoing down the hallway, dragging out the last word. "Hey-lo!" Amy's heart lurched in her chest. No, it's not real," she stammered, her hands gripping her head as if trying to block out the sound. But it was too late. The voice had taken on a rhythmic pattern, repeating over and over, growing louder, until it was almost a chant. "Hello? Hello? Hello?" Brian shot up from the couch, his face stricken. "Stop it!" he shouted, but the voice didn't stop. It mimicked his words exactly, matching his tone, his inflections, as if mocking him. "Stop it!" Mark grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands shaking. "We need to go out there. We can't just stay here and do nothing." But even as he said it, his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. Something deep inside him screamed not to open that door. Amy felt it too, a primal fear that tightened her chest, made her breathing shallow. "Number. We're not going out there," she said, but her voice wavered, betraying her uncertainty. "Whatever it is, it wants us to come outside." Lisa backed up against the wall, her hands shaking. What if it's already inside? The room fell silent. The voice had stopped, leaving behind a thick, suffocating stillness that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. They could hear their own heartbeats, the blood rushing in their ears. It was as if the entire world had gone quiet, holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed through the cabin, followed by a slow, rhythmic knock. It was coming from the front door. "Knock, knock," a voice whispered, barely audible, as if it was right behind their ears. Amy spun around, but there was no one there. Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped the knife. "I'm going to see what it is," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But there was a crack in it, a tremble he couldn't hide. He moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silent cabin. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The others watched, frozen in place, as he slowly reached for the doorknob. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible scratching, like nails dragging down the wood. Mark's hand hovered over the handle, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The scratching stopped. And then the voice came again, clear and cold, almost amused. "Let me in." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to run, but he forced himself to lean forward and peer through the peephole. For a moment, he saw nothing, just darkness. But then slowly, something moved into view. and his blood ran cold. It was a face, inches from the door, but it was wrong. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over sharp, angular bones. The eyes were dark, hollow pits, and the mouth was twisted into a grin, too wide, the lips cracked and bleeding. But the worst part was that the face was his own. Mark staggered back, dropping the knife. "What? What is this?" he gasped, stumbling into the living room. "It's me. It's me." Brian grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him. "What do you mean it's you?" he shouted. But Mark couldn't find the words. He just kept shaking his head, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The others exchanged terrified glances, but before they could react, the knocking resumed, louder and faster this time, like someone pounding on the door with all their strength. "Let me in." The voice was furious now, and it wasn't just Brian's anymore. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping, merging, like a swarm of angry, buzzing insects. They backed away, huddling together in the center of the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and heavy. "We have to do something," Amy said, her voice rising in panic. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to—" A loud crash cut her off. The window shattered, glass spraying across the room as the wind howled through the opening, blowing out the candles and plunging the room into darkness. They screamed, scrambling to find each other in the pitch black, but the cabin seemed to shift around them, like the walls were twisting, rearranging themselves, trapping them. "Everyone stay close!" Mark shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the wind, and then by the whispers, creeping out of every dark corner. "Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!" Lisa felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy, and she jerked away, but when she turned, there was no one there. I can't see," she whimpered, reaching out blindly. She felt a hand grab hers, and for a moment, she was relieved, until she realized the hand was icy cold. She screamed, jerking back, but the hand tightened, pulling her closer. "It's okay, Lisa," a voice whispered, and she recognized it as her own. "It's just me. Let me in." She yanked her hand free, stumbling back, and the darkness swallowed her scream. Amy frantically lit her phone's flashlight, sweeping it around the room, but the light seemed weak, barely piercing the dark. And then she saw it. Shapes, moving in the shadows, circling them, closing in. The shadows took form, one by one, and each of them was a twisted, distorted reflection of the friends. There was a version of Brian, with sunken eyes and a crooked, malicious grin. A version of Amy, her hair matted and her skin cracked. A version of Lisa, with her mouth stretched impossibly wide, as if she was screaming, but no sound came out. And at the center was Mark's doppelganger, still grinning, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "We're here," it whispered, and all the others echoed the words, their voices blending into a nightmarish chorus. "We've always been here." Mark felt like he was going to be sick. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" The shadows stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators playing with their prey. "We don't want anything," they said in unison. "We are you. You invited us." Brian shook his head violently, clutching his ears as if trying to block out the voices. "No, we didn't! We didn't invite you!" But the shadows only laughed, a low, sinister sound that reverberated through the cabin. "Do you remember?" the doppelgangers said, their eyes glinting in the dim light. "Do you remember the story?" Brian's heart dropped. "The loggers, the ones who disappeared," he whispered. What does that have to do with us?" The doppelganger that wore Brian's face stepped forward, leaning down until its face was inches from his. "They weren't just loggers," it said, its voice soft, almost tender. "They were just like you, friends, who came to this forest looking for something. Adventure, escape, a break from reality." Its smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. But they didn't realize that this place, it doesn't like to let go. It shows you things. Things you thought you left behind. Things you didn't know were inside you. And then, when it's done, it keeps you. The shadows closed in, their faces twisting, merging, until they were almost indistinguishable, a writhing, dark mass that seemed to pulse with every breath. "We are the echoes of those who came before," the voices whispered, and their words seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We are the ones who stayed, and now, so are you." The room began to spin, the walls bending, twisting, as if the cabin was swallowing them whole. Mark tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers, all repeating the same phrase over and over. "Let me in, let me in, let me in." The lights flickered, and for a moment they could see themselves, sitting around the campfire, laughing as if nothing had ever happened. But their reflections were twisted, their faces stretched into grins that were too wide, their eyes hollow and dark. And then the lights went out, and there was nothing but darkness. The search party found the cabin a week later, but it was empty. The fire was out, the logs cold, and there was no sign that anyone had been there at all, except for 4 sets of footprints leading away from the porch into the dark, endless stretch of Blackwood Forest. And if you stand there late at night, you might still hear them. The echoes of voices calling out from the trees. "Hello, hello, let me in." But be careful, because once you hear them, they never let you go.